That's 45.
Right, we're live on YouTube now.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
One of the things that we were talking about this morning was the situation where uh, there is no farm, there is no agricultural activity on a parcel, and then there is. And I think maybe the first question is, in that scenario, whether the new farm that comes into being enjoys any protection under the existing uh, any nuisance protection.
Under the existing,
Yeah.
um, they are entitled to a rebuttable presumption if all of the following are met. Had to be in conformity with all federal, state, and local laws, consistent with good ag practices. It has to be established prior to surrounding non-ag activities. So if there are any non-ag activities surrounding it, it would not qualify.
Would a surrounding non-ag activity include development?
Yes.
So right now, if you were to start farming next to somebody's home, you wouldn't be entitled to this presumption.
Likely not.
Yeah, okay. So, okay, good. Well, that's good, I think, as a starting point. So then if you scroll down, Mike, to not the last page, or the second to last page, it's page 7, I guess. And so we were looking at the list in B, so B1, 2, and 3. Here under this language, so same scenario. So no farm but there's a house, and then somebody starts farming. Would there be protection under this new language?
Well, you have to go back to look at the standard. And you would have to look and see if they have good standing and if they're consistent with the agricultural practices. And if they are, then they could receive protection.
So does it matter that they're a new farm? So how does then what does B sub 1 there? What does that add?
Honestly, Steve and I were talking during the break. You probably could get rid of most of 57, 54, especially sub B. I mean, the nuisance protection is still going to apply to a farm, regardless of the change of ownership. The cessation of operation, because the standard, it doesn't relate to new, but Steve was mentioning like maybe you want that to avoid effectively takings claims. But right, so no agricultural activity shall be or become a nuisance when the activity is conducted. That doesn't have a timing issue around it. You don't need to be there for 5 years. You don't need to have been there before the surrounding activity. It allows for change in practices because the way that the agricultural activity is defined, it includes ability to change practice. So you don't really need 57, 54. And that was actually talked about in House Judiciary, but they decided to leave it in.
So leaving it in just would make it explicit if somebody were.
It's already, well, it's not, maybe it's not explicit, but when you look at the definition of agricultural activity, which is referenced with a cross reference, to 6 VSA 4802. That includes change of that includes change of operation, change of cropping. Does it include change of ownership? Can't remember. I don't think it includes change of ownership, but ownership really is irrelevant in underneath this framework. So I don't think you need 5754. And it seems to be creating a lot of questions. So you could get rid of it.
The
5754
B,
B.
okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you could just get rid of it and it wouldn't help, that just suggests that particularly B1 with it's got that metric of 5 years is adding confusion. What about, okay, so we have talked about this morning concerns about the unintended consequences, possible unintended consequences of a change in crops or farming method that results in a large industrial type operation that may not be what we all would like to have. And whether there's a way to draft language that somehow puts guardrails. So that, I think that would mean not completely getting rid of B or doing something else with B if we were to go that direction. So I just want to flag that for now. Unless you have like an immediate thought, Mike, but we could come back to that.
I just have a lot of questions. What is industrial farming? I don't know. How do you define that? What is an expansion that would trigger industrial farming? How would you confine it? I mean, what would be the metric for confining it? Cows, profit, land acreage, and how do you do that? And is that antithetical to? And I mean, you might not all like this, but is that antithetical to capitalism? But which you don't have to conform totally to capitalism, that's for sure. Vermont definitely doesn't, but I just have questions of how that would be done. And then the kind of underlying question, it's the whole, it's a phrase I learned from an environmental advocate back in the day, that you use every tool in your toolbox to achieve your purpose. And would you be using this tool in this toolbox to prevent farm expansion? And you probably could. So I just have a question, that's all.
So I've got two hands here, and then and if anybody wants to speak to this from their own, I may have been putting words in other committee members' mouth. I want other committee members to say what I may have been trying to say, not as well. But Representative Berg, you had your hand up first.
Chair, I am wondering, because I don't know all the details of the RAPs, and given that this is utilizing RAPs and generally accepted agricultural practices, the RAPs stipulate, I know that stipulates buffers from where you apply manure to the edge of waterways. Does it stipulate distances to boundary lines or anything like that?
I think it's
Not in terms of application necessarily, but where is your where your concentrated feed area located with regard to edges of property? I don't know if that's in there. If it is, that would help. in some respect.
I don't know what it says about manure pit, bunk silo. I've seen both well within 10 feet of a boundary. But I know the agency tries to work with farms not to do that. Sometimes that's actually the best place to put one or both of those things. I will have to look at the RAPs about setbacks for wood storage and bunk silos and things of that nature. But my immediate response is I don't think they do.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim, Steve.
Yeah, Steve Collier, Community of Agriculture. So we regulate farm structures and those are required to meet municipal setbacks unless there's no other place on the farm. We do have the ability to grant a variance if municipal setbacks aren't workable. We also have setbacks for water, so drinking wells and other really drinking wells. I don't think there's a specific property boundary setback other than the buffers themselves, but you do have. So municipalities often have property line setbacks for any structure, and so we honor those unless there's no other way to build the infrastructure.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah. I don't know of any industrial scale farming in the state of Vermont. The closest thing I could think of is some of these ultra modern sugar houses. They've gone so big with ROs and fuel fired and steam evaporators and whatnot, and I don't have a problem with those either. Maybe some people think our scale is industrial. In the scope of the United States, we are far, far, far from it. When a farm becomes an LFO, we trigger a whole different set of standards. There's a public hearing to build the facility. And if you're going from 500 cows and you want to jump to 750, that triggers a public hearing where your neighbors are all involved. It's a whole different set of standards. So I wouldn't think that size would be an issue. And I think this bill does well to protect the small diversifying farm, the change of farm use. And that's what, there is a rapid change in some of Vermont, in a sector of Vermont's agriculture, that's change of use. And there are diversifying farms. And, I don't know what the RAPs are for a hog farm. Or the size and scale of hog farms. In the grand scheme of raising hogs, Vermont is not an ideal location to raise hogs because of the cost of grain and growing grain. And they can raise hogs so much cheaper in Iowa and North Carolina and whatnot that we're never going to compete in that market. Now, because there are some I think there are a few hog farms in the state of Vermont that are converted old dairy farms, and I don't think you'd know it if you drove by it. But I don't know a lot about it. It's but I could find out.
Thank you, Representative Boston.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what Richard's just saying here is kind of making me think about how to phrase my question. But I mean, I asked a question earlier today when you weren't here about this sort of change of use and what that looks like. So if I am a neighbor next to a farm that has an organic vegetable farm, I buy the house, I live there, next to me is lots of vegetables, great. Then they decide they want to go into animal agriculture. And then there's a lot of noise, a lot of smell, like it could be whatever animal is. If they end up going on a large scale, that's a different neighbor than what I bought my house on. So like, is there automatically a consideration of the change of, I feel like what we're doing with this bill is we're saying, if you're already a farmer, you can change it to whatever you want and your neighbor doesn't have a right to complain. So if I start out with Richard as my vegetable neighbor and then he becomes a large cow dairy, it's just too bad for me as the neighbor. And if I don't like the smell and the noise of the cows next door, then I move. But I mean, I'm just wondering, like, is there a way? Because like there might be some neighbors who don't care, but there might be some who do. And like, I mean, it's really different to live next to a bunch of animals as opposed to a bunch of vegetables. So I'm just wondering, like, could we have the language say that there's some kind of a review process around certain agricultural transitions or something like that? You know, not to say that they wouldn't be approved, but in some cases they might not be. And I just think in terms of residents who are already existing in a place, changing completely the nature of their community is worth considering as well.
So you could have a review process, but the way that other states deal with that when it's a change of use, there's change of use. It doesn't get the nuisance protection until it's been in activity for a certain amount of time. And the activity wasn't alleged to be a nuisance during that amount of time. So basically you give the neighbor an opportunity to say, no, that change is a nuisance. But after that amount of time has expired, then, and it hasn't been alleged to be a nuisance, then it gets the protection.
But somebody might build a giant farm and then when it's a nuisance, then it becomes a lawsuit and problematic. I mean, I would think it would be easier not to build a farm that's not going to be a pleasant neighbor than to build it and then be like, oh, too bad. You know, and then maybe the non-farming neighbor moves away, or I don't know. It feels a little bit backwards to me, but
So they're farming, they have a farm.
yeah,
They want to change their use.
Yep.
They change it.
yeah,
It results in a nuisance.
yeah,
The people, neighbors bring the nuisance.
yeah.
And they have a certain amount of time to do that, whatever time you designate. After that, if they don't bring that nuisance claim during that period, then they get the protection.
So how long is that time period that they have to determine if they're a
It's like-
nuisance or not?
In different states, it's different. In 2 years is pretty common.
But I think that you were also asking, which I think is a good question, if they do bring the nuisance during that, at any point during those 3 years, then what is the remedy? And if it's for the farmer to stop doing that kind of farming again, that,
The remedy is whatever the court orders. For purposes of the nuisance claim, if the plaintiff, the neighbor shows a nuisance, then the court will order them to abate the nuisance. And I can't tell you what they would have ordered because it depends on the facts.
pretty well set.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, so it sounds like there isn't really a way to do sort of a preventive, like zoning or something.
Now, you could do something like they do for a little large farm, LFO. That,
But would that be part of a nuisance bill or would that be a different bill? If it's about prevention, if you change your farm, you have to apply for some kind of change community something, you know?
I mean, it depends on the scope of what you want to do. Farms have been encouraged to diversify and find as much diversified income streams as they can in order to stabilize themselves against whether or not it's dairy pricing or whether or not it's flooded fields or whether or not it's any other hit to one of their major income streams. They've been encouraged to do that, and so they are changing practices. And you all have wanted them to by the General Assembly. And so the question is, do you give them some protection when they change, add new revenue, add new activity, change the scale of their activity? I mean, you could have the same activity, but you just get a bigger combine harvester. And I mean, they're supposed to be quieter. But I don't know about that.
They're a lot more comfortable.
So, I mean, they are big.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah, check, thank you. So what is the law now? If a guy is 75 years old and his back gives out and he sells his cows and someone comes in and buys the land next to him and puts in a 50-acre high-tech vegetable farm and sets up a farm stand, and now you have traffic all day long going to the farm stand. I'm putting another spin on it, Michelle.
Yep,
You have traffic all day long going to a farm stand, San Mazas or Peak Screens and what's the law now to change, the change of use under our current law?
It wouldn't receive protection because it wouldn't have been established prior to surrounding non-agricultural activities. It would not receive protection because it would not have been established prior to surrounding non-agricultural
So
activities.
change of use doesn't receive protections.
Right. And that's one of the major criticisms in Vermont's current law is that you're encouraging farmers to diversify and evolve, but they don't get protection if they do.
Thank you.
so would this change that? No,
Yes.
it would, so, okay.
So we have the language that we're looking at right there on the screen. The existing statute is crossed out. So C, established prior to non-ag activities. Exact means you don't qualify, or D, if you have, has not significantly changed. So we're crossing out both of those, and then later on in the new language, we're saying, or we have been saying explicitly, you can change. And then there's the language about the 5 years, but Mike was a few minutes ago suggesting we don't even need that because it seems like just the rest of the new language gives a blanket, authority to be protected from a nuisance, regardless of change or regardless of whether your neighbor was there first.
Right. But there are conditions. If it's a negligent operation, you don't get nuisance protection. If it has a substantial adverse effect on public health and safety, you don't get the protection. And the substantial adverse effect on public health or safety is similar to the current standard, not exactly the same. You can rebut the presumption under the current standard. Oh, where is it? Where it has a substantial adverse effect on health and safety or welfare.
Okay, let's just take a minute to talk about that then. Health, safety, and welfare. Those are pretty big terms. So does limiting it to health and safety and leaving welfare out have a substantial effect?
I don't really know what welfare means in this context. I think when you look at other states, it's health and safety. Welfare of what? Welfare of whom? And if it's of whom and it's persons, then it's health or safety. Like that, I guess maybe welfare could be the operation of a business. I don't know.
And does the addition of the word public substantially change anything here in the language that's in statute that's crossed out here in the proposed bill? Has an adverse effect on health, safety, and welfare? It doesn't say public.
So so nuisance law, there's two major claims you bring. You can bring a private nuisance claim. You can allege that the activity from the neighboring land or land in proximity to you is impairing the use and enjoyment of your personal use of the land. And then there's public nuisance where the activity creates a broader risk for public health and safety, and it's not just a personal impairment, it's an impairing of the public's health and safety. And that's what this language is about, the public health and safety, kind of saying if you're creating a public nuisance, public health nuisance, then you don't get nuisance protection. If your activity is that impactful to the area, then you do not receive protection.
So just questions about that,
Yeah.
Representative O'Brien?
So when you start violating some sort of pollution laws to begin with, like the hog farm that's creating such odors and vapors that it's, harming or even killing, neighbors downstream or downwind in the Carolinas, does that start violating any federal or state laws, even if they were following the similar operations, agricultural methods? Like we had a question in Vermont like that, like are there health statutes that you start violating besides just RAPs?
Well, there's a provision in here. Where is it? That this doesn't affect the ability for a public health board to determine that there's a public health risk.
Page 7, line 7.
Right. It does not restrict or impede the authority of the state to protect the public health, safety, environment, or welfare. So there's the ability for the state to basically say, you're violating the law. Maybe you're not violating the law. So where is it on the existing law? Yeah, that was it. That was the language I was thinking of. Oh, no, this is it. Nothing in the section shall be construed to limit the authority of state or local boards of health to abate nuisances affecting the public health. So you give local boards of health authority to abate those public nuisances. But I don't know enough about hog farming to say, odor from a hog farm and what their practices are, what would be consistent with law or consistent with just, good agricultural practice. I don't know.
I just wonder, right, in general in Vermont, there are statutes outside of ag or A&R statutes that deal with public health, right? So that
Right. And
a violation there of some sort or.
and maybe this is the time to say that this doesn't protect a farmer from all litigation. Doesn't even protect the farmer from a nuisance litigation. It gives the farmer a defense if there is litigation for nuisance. The plaintiff can always try to defeat that by saying that they're not in good standing under the current standard. They are not conducting their practices in conformity with local custom. That it was negligent. So there's opportunity, and then they're going to bring other claims. They're gonna try other ways to stop the activity that is harmful to them, allegedly harmful to them. And what that would be, I don't know, maybe they file a complaint with A&R and say the farm is violating environmental laws, and A&R is required to go out and inspect any complaint, and maybe A&R finds something. And it's when these issues snowball, they snowball with more than just nuisance.
Representative Boswell?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering if you could give a local example of what would qualify as a substantial adverse agricultural effect. You know, like, would it be something about pesticides? Would it be about air quality? I mean, like, what would qualify? I mean, if they said hog farms aren't that common here, what would be the kind of thing that if it were set up wouldn't fall under this because it's too egregious?
Well, it's going to be fact dependent, situation to situation, but I think you can look at the recent case. The judge ultimately decided the final disposition of the case on a trespass claim, but she also discussed application of the right to farm protection. And she stated that the odor, the aroma could at times or could have been determined to be a substantial adverse effect that would have overcome the nuisance protection
And that was from dairy.
from a dairy.
Okay.
And I think that's partly what is creating anxiety in part of the agricultural community, because they build an NRCS approved waste storage facility that met NRCS standards. And yes, they did it because they expanded, and they were managing and doing what they were supposed to do with their manure pond and the land applying according to what they were supposed to be doing. And the judge said that that could have been a substantial adverse effect, and that, I think that created a substantial amount of anxiety in the farming community that they were doing what they were supposed to do. And a judge could say that that was subject to a nuisance claim.
Can we go back to the page 6 and line 14? So, how a couple of things that I think are different from the existing law is this: we've got the word public here, which makes it a more difficult hurdle to establish, because it's not just the plaintiff's health and safety, but the public's health and safety. And then secondly, that now it's incumbent on the plaintiff to demonstrate this rather than on the farmer.
Correct.
That's what you're
Okay.
It
Good.
was on the plaintiff under the current law too, because you only needed to argue this in current law once the nuisance protection would have attached. And then the plaintiff says, oh, even though the nuisance protection attached, I have a substantial adverse health and safety and welfare effect that overcomes the nuisance protection.
Okay. Yes, okay. So that was not one of the conditions. That was
Right.
a way you could rebut it.
About it.
Okay. Representative Burt?
Yeah, I guess I just need for more clarity. Being said there, it seems unnecessary to me, looking at it from a uneducated standpoint, but in your opinion, is it necessary and a good thing to put in that line, on line 14?
Is it necessary to have the agricultural activity as substantial? It's not necessary. It's not. This allows a way to pierce the nuisance protection. It wasn't in the House Judiciary draft, several drafts. But then I was asked to include it. And that's what was in the last draft.
Isn't it? If you're doing something that has substantial adverse effect on public health and safety, isn't that just something else that would be brought against the farm? against, whoever's performing the agricultural activity anyway?
I mean, it depends.
It would override a nuisance. I no, but.
I know what you're saying. I mean,
Yeah.
as I can't remember who asked, wouldn't there be other options? There might be other options. It's very fact dependent. It's hard for me to say that you would not, if you wanted to allow someone to overcome the nuisance protection, I don't know if there would always be other alternatives than C2. I don't know if that
You just,
clearly.
Greg, are you still going?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Um, Well, let's stick on the health and safety issue, because the other two references to health and safety that say nothing in this statute is construed to mean, et cetera, et cetera. Are either of those, strictly speaking, necessary to have in this bill? Or are they just there to provide reassurance to somebody who might think it's gone too far?
I don't think you need on page 7 or 9, lines 7 and 8, because the state's independent authority, separate from this subchapter, it stands alone. And so if the state has authority to enforce a public health risk or public health hazard, then they would have the ability to do that. Same with any environmental law or any animal welfare law or something similar. The state would still retain that authority. So you don't necessarily need that language on 7 and 8.
And presumably the state is well aware that it retains that authority, so it doesn't need this line here to remind it.
You never know.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah, the way I read it, 7 and 8's always been there. I'd leave it there on page 7, line 7 and 8. The line on line 14 on page 6 is bothersome to me, is if I have a neighbor move in, as I said earlier, that is asthmatic and allergic to hay, and I don't cut my hay in time, and I would argue they created a nuisance by moving next to a hayfield and out of downtown Newport. But anyway, that's where I come from on this. Leave 7 and 8. So the state has that authority.
So does that, Mike, does that scenario fall under, so back up on page 6 there in line 14, if a new neighbor had asthma, would that qualify as public health and safety?
I would argue that it doesn't. Maybe the neighbor is able to show that it has an effect beyond the neighbor and it has an effect on others. But currently, it's not public health. In fact, currently, they just need to show that it affects them. Substantial adverse effect on health, safety, or welfare. So currently, the neighbor might be able to show that it has a substantial effect on them.
In the current statute?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Representative Supranat?
How's that any different than the earth having pollen in existence in general? And somebody having allergies?
Well, I think Rep. Nelson just said he didn't cut his hay in time. So it seeded, and which creates more pollen. And
What if we're letting that happen for habitat biodiversity? What if we're saying we want to leave this hayfield going for a little bit because it is going to be important for erosion measures, for the fact that we've had a really dry season, for the fact that we want to give this land a rest for a little bit, for the fact that it's fallow, I mean, there are tons of farmers who let fields build up. There are tons of people who let fields build up. So I don't understand why an allergy that somebody has about hay would be a concern to this with all of the other natural pollen impacts that exist in the globe.
I mean, some people, allergies are lethal. And so it's possible that they can show that the farming technique increases the risk of death because of that allergy. That's a viable claim.
That's a viable claim.
So under existing law, again, we're not talking about public health, but just one neighbor,
Right.
the rebuttable piece.
And we're not talking about public health. We're talking about the existing, there's one person's health, safety, or welfare.
So line 8 and 9 there.
Yeah.
If right now that neighbor could say, I have a life-threatening allergy.
I have to like interject. We're like going into hypothetical land, and you learn this in like your first year law course. Like, there's always the kid that sits in the front row, and it's like, what if, what if, what if, what if, and then you're like, what if I murder you, kid in the front row?
Yeah.
Are you at the point where you're ready to reach out?
I am not. But basically what I'm saying is that like you can't in laws like these, it's very fact dependent. It's very dependent on the plaintiff's set of facts and the defendant's set of facts. It's dependent on the activity and on the landscape. It's really hard to answer with clarity, complete clarity, all of the questions with the hypotheticals. There will be litigation. There will be precedent that clarifies the statute. There will be people that are not protected, and there will be people that are harmed. It's part of this law as it's going to be applied. And it might be easier for large farms to navigate it, but it's not dependent on whether or not you're a large farm. It's not dependent on what type of activity you are or not. So it's a difficult policy decision, and you have a lot of factors that you have to review in making those decisions. But unfortunately, I can't answer all the hypotheticals.
Did somebody else have a hand up? Representative O'Brien? Or Representative Burke?
You did earlier.
I did, but I was just gonna say, the fact that it switches from, so that we're looking at public health and safety, another thing, light bulb goes off. You can't have an individual with asthma being able to make a claim against the farm. It has to be affecting more than one person. It has to be affecting the public instead of one person, right? And I guess to your point that, we're looking at broadly what this bill is going to do versus current statute. To just bear those things in mind.
Representative O'Brien.
Mike, can loss of assessed value because of what your neighbor does on their land, whether it's farming or, a junkyard or whatever, can that be a nuisance claim? Because I could see that getting into welfare.
That's probably going to be a takings claim versus a nuisance claim. But if you're going to bring a nuisance claim, you're probably going to say, and it affects the value of your property, you're going to assert that as a part of your damages and the need for relief from the activity.
Would be defer.
Right, and again, it'd be like the plaintiff would bring as many viable claims as they could. to get the relief, the ultimate relief that they're looking for.
So there's nuisance, there's trespass, and takings is its own.
Takings, normally the takings claims are against the state because it's the state law or the municipal law. You would say that the state is allowing that activity under its water quality law or farming law, and that created the taking.
There's one other piece of the existing statute that I wanted to mention, and I had mentioned it to you, Mike. It's not, so it was dropped, it's lost, and it may be significant, and if it is, I think we just need to talk about it. That's on line 10 here, so whatever page we're on, page 5, the noxious and significant interference with use and enjoyment of the neighboring property. So currently, that's one of the mechanisms for rebutting. And that's on the plaintiff. It's not something that the defendant has to show the farmer.
Correct.
So we've lost that. And what would it mean to lose that as opposed to keeping it in and inserting it on the next page underneath the public health and safety line?
Well, it's another way for a plaintiff to pierce the nuisance protection. It's another way for them to say, oh, maybe I didn't have a health, safety, or welfare adverse effect, but the agricultural activity interferes so severely or so significantly with my use and enjoyment of the property that I can't use it. And that's another way that you would pierce the nuisance protection.
Is that in that other case that you were referring to, was that the test that was applied?
I mean, she definitely looked at both. I can't remember which standard she looked at when she said it probably would have been the nuisance protection would have been overcome. I can't remember which one she looked at. John, do you remember? You.
I know she described, Steve Calder, I know she described the manure as noxious. I don't remember if she was applying that specific standard, but that if you were spreading chicken manure, someone could say it's a noxious smell and the judge could subjectively interpret that.
I can't deny that.
Yeah, I mean, significant interference with use and enjoyment might it depends how you interpret it, right? If it's for a few minutes, if it's all afternoon, all evening, every day, there's different. Okay, we're almost at 2:00, and I did say that we probably would try and wrap this up by 2. I think that for next steps, I'm going to suggest that I'm going to try and work with Mike. I'm going to try and take what I've heard. Happy to, if other people have other thoughts, over the weekend, let me know. We'll try to come back with something that we can look at on Tuesday and see where we are with it. All right. Thank you, Mike. We are done for the day. We have, I think I heard several bills that were supposed to have been taken up today were pushed off till Tuesday. So I'm guessing we won't be here Tuesday morning in this room. And got other testimony scheduled, I think, starting at 1:30, which, I mean, 1:30 might be ambitious too. But we'll, and as we're done with the floor plus our time plus lunch.
1:20.